Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss a very interesting topic. It's about Einstein's brain. It was subject to a lot of research actually, and it was removed in quite, well, let's say, a most unfortunate circumstance. Okay, so let's get going with this presentation. So this is the outline. First we'll speak about introduction, some history about how Einstein's brain was removed, storage conditions for Einstein's brain, prevailing myths, why these myths came to be, a literature review of the relevant studies, which aren't as much as one would think, and what the studies missed, the truth, and how to spot the truth in articles you read about Einstein's brain, a discussion, future considerations, and a conclusion. Okay, so let's begin. So as an introduction, everyone knows Einstein, one of the most influential physicists. He won a Nobel Prize, not for what you think, which is the general and special theories of relativity, but he won it for the photoelectric effect, and he had widespread fame during his lifetime, unlike someone like Newton. And it's very important to know what made his brain tick, or maybe not. We'll get to see in this presentation. Okay, so Einstein, usually it's considered that he didn't really want his brain to be studied. But Thomas Harvey, the pathologist who oversaw the autopsy of Einstein, stole his brain. Later, Einstein's son Hans Albert gave Harvey a reluctant blessing to use the brain, but only for science. Now, the storage conditions of Einstein's brain, it was cut up into 240 blocks, each about 10 centimeters cubed. It was left largely untouched for 23 years, and a bit more than that, about 30 kind of. These are, the brain was suspended in 10% formalin, and the slides were encased in celloidin, which is a waxy substance. These are the storage conditions. Now, the fact that it was left largely untouched for 23 years is a very interesting fact to know. It's because many people did not really notice any significant change in Einstein's brain, contrary to what the popular press would like to make you believe. So that's why the studies were not forthcoming for a while. But later on, a very, very important study came about, which was later described. Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So there's this prevailing myth that Einstein was a mathematical genius. He was, of course, an exceptional mathematician, don't get me wrong. Some people who say that he wasn't a mathematical genius want to downplay this part, but of course he was a mathematical genius, but not as much as his contemporaries in physics, and obviously not as much as someone dedicated to mathematics. And many articles would like to make you believe he has more glial cells, or his brain is larger in certain areas. And there's this key myth that we're going to talk about, which is the structure myth. That is that if Einstein's brain is larger in one area, it necessarily means that this is the reason for his genius, which could not be the case. He might have a pathological change in one of his brain areas that makes it larger. And of course, such a pathological change would make him less of a genius, not more. So it's unclear if we just look at the structure of the brain, if that means that Einstein would be smarter. And he thought in images rather than words. That's like a kind of woo mystery concept of genius. Wow, he thought in images rather than words. I don't think that's really the case, and we'll get into that later. And of course, I mean, his concepts about relativity, I mean, these aren't things that you can really think about more than conceptually. You think about them conceptually, but you don't really visualize something. I know he visualized riding on a beam of light and such things, but the curvature of space and time isn't something like you deeply have an intuition of. And especially with the development of quantum mechanics, no one has really this intuition about these things. And he benched about 350. Nuh-uh, he did not. Okay, so why the myths make sense? It would make sense that if Einstein had like this little difference in brain structure compared to the average human being, this is the reason for his genius. It seems like a very logical conclusion, but as I said, it's not, because it might be a pathological change, it might be related to other things, it might not actually improve. It's a big leap of faith to think so. And it makes sense that he'd be a mathematical genius because physics requires a great deal of mathematics. And there's publication bias which goes on, which means that research that doesn't show results is not published. So there were studies about Einstein in the early years, Einstein's brain, when Harvey stole his brain. um, and they were never published because they didn't note really any significant differences. And this is actually confirmed in a study by Einstein, which said, a study on Einstein's brain, which said that earlier years were not research in earlier years was not covered or was not published in journals. And there's confirmation bias, which is when you're looking at a sample of Einstein's brain, you're really trying to notice a difference because it's Einstein's brain. So researchers need to be, no blinding of researchers. So researchers need to be blinded about whose brain it is, so they don't mix them up or make Einstein's brain to be different when it's not. Okay, so the literature review will consist of two studies: histological studies, which look at cells, individual cells, and morphological studies, which look at the general brain structure or gross anatomy. Okay, so the most important study, or rather review, on Einstein's brain studies was by Heinz in 2014. It will largely form the basis of my criticism of these studies. It was a scathing review, and it showed that these studies lacked good methodology. They did not have good statistics and no proper control groups really. Some did, but not as proper as they need to be. And he really showed the futility of analyzing just one individual. Something we will later talk about is maybe we should analyze smart individuals in general, like leading physicists, instead of just one Einstein. Because yes, Einstein, let's say, is the most influential 20th century physicist, but there are others like him, or close to him. So the first study was Diamond et al., 1985. Notice, if you remember, when did Einstein die? Actually, I didn't tell you. Okay, he died in 1955. So it took a long while before any studies were forthcoming. So 1985 was the first study. So they compared two sections, one section each from the left and right Broadman's areas 9 and 39. And they noticed that in only one section of these four, it had a higher number of glial cells. Unfortunately, the control group was not Einstein's age. And something we'll later talk about is that glial cells increase with age. So this number of higher glial cells is maybe due to age. And also they came from a lower socioeconomic status, which is in general associated with lower intelligence. And they performed many measures, 28 in total. On these four areas, they had the number of astrocytes, they had the number of glial cells, the number of neurons. Only 1 out of 28 was significant. And if you consider 1 out of 28 being significant, it means that probably this 1 out of 28 could be just due to random statistical chance, because only it was this one measure out of 28. So yeah, so this study is largely discredited and very easy to attack, basically, because of the lack of statistics and lack of proper statistics and control group. Now the next study came in 1996 by Anderson and Harvey. It showed that Einstein had a thinner cortex but the same number of neurons. This meant that Einstein's neurons were more tightly packed. They were closer together. The control group was elderly, to rule out age or cognitive decline. So in this case, the control group was fine. But we'll look at Colombo et al. 2006 for criticism. They show that in schizophrenics there is an increased number of neurons which are more tightly packed. Okay, so Colombo et al. Argue against structure equals performance, which is what these two prior papers seem to imply. Einstein has this specific brain structure, so he has this measure of performance. And they note that complex tasks require multiple areas to be activated. So it doesn't make sense to compare just this one facet of Einstein's brain and notice that it's bigger or something, and then say that this is the reason he could perform better on complex tasks. And they actually note that it's important to differentiate between glial cell types. And again, they show that changes in glia could be related to age, with an increase generally be showing it due to age. So they actually did find some differences in Einstein's brain, though, which is a more parallel palisade than the rest of the sample is alanized, although there was some variability. But again, it's unclear what this indicates. Why would a more parallel palisade indicate general intelligence? And they criticized Anderson's and Harvey studies, again, because schizophrenics show the same increased neuronal density. And they noted a very interesting paradox, which is that to know how Einstein's brain behaved when he was at its peak, we need to take a look at a younger Albert Einstein. Perhaps, to be able to look at a younger Einstein, which we can't do now, of course, we need to extrapolate to the general population. But that doesn't make sense because the general population is different from Albert Einstein, or that's what the hypothesis about Albert Einstein's brain would make us think. So this is a bit of a paradox. So there's also the study by Mann et al. In 2014. They showed that Einstein's corpus callosum was in general bigger on many counts. However, these counts were dependent on each other. So let's say you have a middle line length in the corpus callosum and the overall length. These, of course, if you have a higher middle line length, it's expected you'll have a higher overall length in the corpus callosum. So these were dependent measures, and there wasn't any statistics to show to differentiate which dependent measure was doing which effect. And a very interesting tidbit that's noted by Heinz in his 2014 review is that a thicker corpus callosum in the posterior part is associated with higher intelligence, but not in the anterior part. There's a study about this, which you can see in the references. But Einstein had a thicker corpus callosum throughout, so that's not clearly indicative of intelligence. And even so, if we were to take like a sample of highly influential physicists, I would imagine their corpus callosum would be just as big as Einstein's, or maybe slightly less. So there's nothing really special about a big corpus callosum in smarter individuals. But it's still, this is one of these findings that does seem to hold up to scrutiny. So that's a good study by Mann et al. There is also a study by Zaidel in 2001, or Zaidel. They found a difference in the hippocampus of AE, which isn't much studied. Generally, they focused more on the cerebral cortex or other brain structures. In Einstein, the temporal lobe. No one really focused on the hippocampus. They found that the left hippocampus was slightly increased, and that there was an asymmetry in Einstein's brain in terms of the hippocampus, left and right. But these changes may be related to age or other factors, and really they don't make much sense because Einstein wasn't noted for his superior memory or anything like that. But of course, a genius is made from a very good memory. So okay, that might be a good finding. Now, Whittleson et al. Study in 1999 was a very important study. It was published in The Lancet, a very prestigious journal. It noted that there was no parietal operculum, which is observed in almost all other brains. And the hypothesis was that the parietal lobes developed early and kind of pushed out the parietal operculum. And thus the Sylvian fissure, which separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal, it had different morphology. And they noted that the parietal lobes were symmetrical, while in normal brains, right is bigger than left. But later on, Galaburda and Fock et al. Noted that there was an operculum. So this largely discredited Whittleson's main hypothesis. And it shows something very important, that it's not so easy to just take a look at brain structures, even for eminent neuroscientists, and find out which part is different, which part is not, because they're so difficult to tease out, and the parietal lobes are so convoluted. It's very difficult to just take a look and find out. So we mentioned these folk studies in 2009, 2012. they noted a lot of differences between Einstein's brain and other brains, but there are some differences that really maybe just related to age. The man was 76 when he died. So there were a lot of these differences that don't really make much sense in the overarching hypothesis, which is that Albert Einstein had a bigger brain than the rest, or that's the reason of his intelligence. They noted that the brain was neither spherical nor symmetrical, contrary to what Whittleson said. And really, it's unclear what these features mean, because some of them just don't make much sense. But it's still a very well put through study, and maybe these differences might show something later on when we get to know brain morphology and brain changes more as science progresses, of course. And of course, they relate this images rather than words myth. In a part of the study they say that Einstein had a small difference in one of the areas relating to face and tongues, so that might explain his thinking in images rather than words, but that's a bit of a stretch, to be honest. There's the study by Chen et al. In 2014. It's a mini review, and it notes all the unique features. It's a mini review about Fock's study, and it cautions against overinterpretation of these results by Fock. And there is this very interesting consideration, like this is what I'm saying doesn't make much sense in the Fock studies. Einstein had a lot of much more convolution in speech areas. This would indicate that Einstein was a better speaker. But of course, this is not the case, as many biographers of Einstein would know. He was not an especially good speaker, and probably he was a bit of a shy man, and there are even some studies which claim that Einstein was autistic or on the autistic spectrum. But this is a topic for another day. So that's why these findings by Fock et al., they're well made, they're well put through, but it's not clear what they really mean. So what all of these studies missed is that there was no blinding of researchers and no control for these biases, especially confirmation bias, because I'm looking at Einstein's brain, oh, there must be something different. Lack of proper control groups, especially in the Diamond et al. Study. The appropriate control group might be physicists, eminent physicists. That's what we need to have perhaps as a control group. And it's a big jump to believe that different structure equals an explanation of the abilities. So the truth. Wow, the truth. Einstein's brain was special, but so are all brains. And that's something that's very important to know. If I take 10, 100, 1,000, each brain would be different in some way or form. And then it's unclear whether this structure is associated with intelligence. If I can find out this structure, oh yeah, that's associated with intelligence. Maybe a larger corpus callosum, but also that's not so clear. And the studies had a lot of methodological flaws. The structure equals function leap, the sample size, the controls. And it's important to remember, not as much of a mathematical genius as one would think. So if you're reading an article, and this is what we're going to say in this slide, you need to have an eye for the truth. So if you're reading an article, look at the references it has. If it's one of these studies, which it must have, because these are basically all of the studies on Einstein's brain, you need to remember what I said about these studies, the criticism of these studies, which one is good, which one is bad, which one maybe shows too much, all of that. So you know what to watch out for. And if you see like someone saying Einstein was a mathematical genius, you probably take the rest of what he's saying with a grain of salt, or she's saying. Yes, so everything we've talked about. Okay, so a discussion and how to improve on these studies. So again, they had multiple methodological flaws, and it's unclear whether his brain morphology explains his genius. So we need better age-matched controls. This is especially true in Diamond et al. Study. We need to check whether these differences are found in other brains. For example, in a no parietal operculum, they looked at about 50 brains, but maybe in a sample of 1,000, you would find people without parietal operculum. But again, if you remember, this study was discredited with its et al. And you need to check the brains. I really believe in this. You need to have as a control group the brains of other scientists. and actually something we'll discuss later on here in the conclusion more so. Okay, I'll leave it till then. Okay, so future considerations, we need to find better controls, not focus so much. A very important point. We don't need, I believe that we shouldn't focus on the brain of just one eminent physicist. We need to focus on multiple others. So a leading group of physicists and compare them to the general population, okay? Or normal people. We need to have a better understanding of the brain, of course. That would help a lot. For example, in the Corpus Callosum case, we really don't know much about how the Corpus Callosum is associated with intelligence. There aren't many studies about it. There is just like 2, I believe. And we need to not make the structure equals function leap of faith when it can't be tested. Because if I show you the structure of Heinz, and this is something Heinz really stresses on, if I show you this difference in brain morphology in Einstein, who's to say that this exact difference, okay, is the reason for this increased genius of Einstein? No one, right? Okay, and the further point is that if this difference is true, how do we know it's true? We need to test it. We need to show that if I remove, or if I, let's say, remove part of the corpus callosum, it decreases intelligence. But we can't do that because Einstein is just one individual. And of course we can't do that more generally because of course doing these studies on humans is unethical and unfeasible. But it's something that could in theory be done, maybe in lab animals, so that would be possible. But if we're just comparing Albert Einstein's brain, we just have one brain to compare, so that's not a proper experimental group as well, and that's a big problem. So the conclusion is that there were many methodological flaws in these studies, several ways to fix these flaws, most important of which is changing not just the control group, but the point which I was going to mention earlier. It's the test group, which I was mentioning earlier. It's to change not just looking at Albert Einstein, but no too much attention is made on one individual, so we need to look at others. And the testable group should include eminent scientists and to compare these scientists with the general population. Okay, so that's my presentation on Albert Einstein's brain. A very interesting topic. I had a pleasure researching this topic. I hope to have more videos about these interesting things. Perhaps I will do another video on other genius brains or genius brains that were, okay, there was this study on Lenin's brain. Lenin, well, it's controversial to say he was genius, of course. Okay. Yeah, so all of these very, very important studies on other people's brains, Gauss, Lenin, there were others, of course. We will maybe take a look at them in one video, because Einstein's brain is the brain that received the most attention and the highest amount of studies. So perhaps that will be the topic of my next video. Okay, so here are the references that helped me make this video possible, and the image credits. And with that, I will bid you a farewell. Thanks guys for watching.